Cool. Round of applause again.
All right. So today I'm going to talk about our paper, Buying Time, Latency versus Bidding and Transaction Ordering. And this is joint work with Akaki and at Felten, who are at Offchain Labs, and Christoph, who is at the City University of London. So transaction ordering, as we've seen, is like super crucial in financial applications because the time and order of trade execution of a user directly affects their profit. So if a user wants to make a trade on an exchange and gets reordered, then this can directly affect the profit that she is expecting. And this is both important in the traditional finance world and also in the decentralized finance world. So for example, in the TradFi world, the execution order is first come, first serve. This is kind of natural and intuitive. And in fact, in a lot of jurisdictions, this is actually the only policy that's legal. So for example, when there's any price movement at one exchange, it creates this arbitrage opportunity with another exchange. And there's this rush to profit for being the first person to transfer this information from one exchange to another. So in fact, this has led to, over the years, a lot of firms investing in low latency infrastructure, sometimes billions of dollars, and essentially competing or racing with others to be the fastest to transfer this information. And today, these so-called HFT or high frequency trading firms often account for more than 50% of all transactions that take place on these traditional exchanges. And in some sense, like all of this investment into latency really has no other benefit. Like it's not impacting the system as a whole in any other way other than just racing with other participants of the system. And sort of similar issues with transaction ordering have been seen in the decentralized world as well. So for example, in DeFi specifically, miners or validators on blockchains have full control over what transaction ordering is included in the block. So even what transactions are included, what transactions are censored, and all of the ordering that goes around in the block. So there was this work called Flashboys 2.0 by Diane et al. That's several years old at this point that first coined this term miner extractable value, or MEV, which has now been renamed to maximal extractable value. And the idea is it captures this power of the validator or miner in reordering or inserting or censorship of transactions. And in the last few years, a massive sort of industry has emerged to essentially compete for the right to order transactions. So essentially, you have these searchers or bidders find most profitable opportunities and then pay the validators to finalize that ordering. And this market is super competitive, and a conservative estimate sort of puts it at around $400 million of extracted value just in the past year. So this work kind of seeks to answer a question of designing an ordering policy that maintains sort of reasonable first come, first serve guarantees, but minimizes the impact of latency racing. So we think first come, first serve is intuitive, it's natural, in a lot of jurisdictions, again, it's the only sort of legal thing. But we also want to prevent some of the bad things associated with first come, first serve, which is that it incentivizes latency racing. And in particular, we also want to emphasize that we want to prevent MEV extraction that's based on transaction content. So you don't want to allow things like front running or sandwich attacks. And looking ahead, our protocol sort of combines timestamps. So this is the first come, first serve property, and bidding, the bids that are associated with the transactions in order to buy so-called priority for your transaction. And so we focus on the centralized setting. So you can think about layer 2 sequencers. But we can adapt to the decentralized setting, and we can discuss different ways to do that, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. And I'll sort of also mention that just the general approach of encrypting transactions or having like an encrypted mempool doesn't necessarily solve this latency racing problem, because whenever you decrypt the transaction, that still creates this first mover advantage of whoever has the information about the decrypted transactions first can take advantage of this by, again, racing to submit their transaction first. So why do we consider the centralized setting? There's two major reasons. The first being that ordering and decentralization are largely orthogonal problems. And in many cases, the output of the decentralized sequencer can be thought of as input to like a centralized protocol. So if you want to transform a centralized protocol into a decentralized setting, we can sort of have this direct transformation this way. And this is kind of seen in other decentralized variations of ordering protocols as well. For example, these first come, first serve, or fair ordering protocols can be thought of as decentralized implementations of first come, first serve, or a threshold decryption is like a decentralized version of a private mempool. And the second sort of major point why we consider the centralized setting is these sequencers are actually existing today on Ethereum L2 chains. So this makes it a very relevant current direction to work on before decentralized sequencing eventually takes over. So this is sort of an immediate problem that we need to address at this layer before decentralization takes over. So what are some of the goals that we want for a transaction ordering policy? So the first one, as I said, is we want some kind of data independence. So we should not have our ordering based on transaction content, because this leads to sort of harmful MEV extraction on sandwiches or front-running attacks. And so the other thing is this can also be compatible with an encrypted mempool, so you don't see the transactions in the first place. So we want some sort of low finalization time. And this is kind of important for a user experience as well, so they don't have to wait too long for their transaction to be finalized. And these first two properties in general are useful for regular users interacting with the system. The later two properties are sort of important to manage the incentives of arbitrageurs or other entities that want to seek profit from the system. So I'll explain these two properties in a bit, but these are independence of irrelevant transactions and the inclination to spend through bidding instead of investments in latency. So what do you mean by independence of irrelevant transactions? So here's a simple example. Suppose that we have two arbitrageurs, Alice and Bob, and Alice wants to backrun an event A, and Bob wants to backrun an event B. So by backrunning, I mean inserting a transaction or being the first person to insert a transaction right after that event has taken place. And if these two events are independent, we would want our policy to support that Alice's and Bob's strategy should be orthogonal or independent. They shouldn't have to worry about who else is competing on different opportunities. They should only worry about what opportunity they are competing on in order to decide their strategy. So it's kind of a nice property that allows for independent events to be arbitraged. The second sort of nice property that we want is we want to encourage spending through bidding instead of latency infrastructure. So as I said before, latency infrastructure is sort of an external cost to the system, which doesn't really benefit in any meaningful way. So we want to incentivize these arbitrageurs to bid for priority instead of investing in latency infrastructure. And I want to emphasize again that this is not sort of an arbitrary power to change the ordering. So there should be, again, no reordering based on transaction content, but whenever there's latency racing in the traditional setting, we want them to bid instead, because this is something that can be captured inside the protocol and potentially be used for protocol development or some kind of other funding. And I'll say that we cannot fully eliminate latency advantage, provably, but the goal is sort of minimize it as much as possible. So to start off with some definitions, for our purposes, a transaction is just a tuple with a timestamp and a bid, and content is sort of abstracted away since we want data-independent policies. And so an ordering policy P takes input some set of transactions and outputs a linear order between these transactions. And now these independent of irrelevant transactions, what this essentially means is if you have a policy that if you have two transactions, say A and B, the ordering between them doesn't change regardless of what other transactions you include in this policy. So if you have just the two of them independently versus you add an arbitrary other amount of transactions, the policy should still output the same for these two transactions. So sort of the first lemma that we have in the paper says if you want independence of irrelevant transactions, that's identical to having a score-based policy. So what's a score-based policy? So score-based policy is one that essentially has a score function, say S, which takes the timestamp of the bids, and essentially outputs a score for each transaction. And now the policy, what it does is just simply orders these transactions in the descending order of bids. So each transaction is sort of scored individually. So it's easy to see that if a policy is score-based, then it satisfies this IIT property. And we show in the paper that if a policy satisfies IIT, then it has to be score-based, proving this equivalence between the two properties. So I'll get to our protocol, which we propose. It's called time boost. And the idea is we combine timestamps with bids. And intuitively, it's a similar spirit to first come, first serve ordering, but we allow users to buy time with their bidding. So effectively, what this means is you can decrease the timestamp of your transaction by paying some priority fee. So let's say we have a score-based policy that's with function s. So we have s of b comma t. And the score is essentially this priority function that decreases your bid. So it decreases your timestamp. So say pi of b minus t. So the score is pi of b minus t. And you can think about the new timestamp that you get as the timestamp, original timestamp t minus this pi of b. And now you can sort by descending order of scores. And the main intuition, again, is to move the competition that's happening in latency to bidding, which can be captured inside the protocol. So priority function should satisfy some natural properties. The first thing is bidding 0 should buy you 0 time, so that's sort of a normalization. And then we should have the first derivative be positive, which means that if you bid more, then you should be able to buy more time. We also want user transactions to be not delayed by more than g time, so you cannot buy more than g time. And we also want the priority to be concave, which essentially implies that the cost of producing a signal is convex, which will be useful for some of our analysis. So one simple function that we chose for the paper is pi of b equals gb over b plus c for some constant c greater than 0. And for our analysis, we'll use c equals 1, but we describe in the paper a little bit about changing c as well. So some preliminaries for our analysis. Let's say we have 2 players that are competing on an arbitrage opportunity, and a general analysis with n players is deferred to the full paper. So we have valuations v1 and v2, which are distributed according to, let's say, uniform 0, 1 for this talk. And these valuations are for winning the arbitrage opportunity. And now players can choose to spend both in latency infrastructure and bidding. And so for latency, we have a cost c to deliver a transaction within time t. And for this analysis, we use c of t equals 1 over t. And the other thing is we have bidding, so you can bid b to get extra pi of b priority. And the 2 models that we analyze in the paper differ in the kind of latency investment that you can make. So the first model is ex-ante latency investment, which means the latency investment has to be made in advance. And this essentially captures the models where arbitrage needs immediate action. So you have some information at one exchange and you want to move it to another sort of system, and that needs immediate action. The second one is interim latency investment. And this is where you can choose your latency investment after learning the valuation of the arbitrage. And in some cases, you can have arbitrage opportunities that take some time to be realized, in which case you can have this model where your transactions can be scheduled ahead of time. And this can be used to capture, for example, NFT drops, where you have like a fixed time that, the opportunity will start. And bidding is always ex post, which happens after you learning your own valuation and the other's latency investment. So some brief analysis of the results. In the first model, there's sort of 2 cases. Case one is when there's no difference in the latency spending for the 2 players. And here we have a fully separating equilibrium, which is fully efficient because it means that a player with a larger valuation will bid more. In the second case, when you do have some latency difference, let's say delta, then we sort of have a partially separating equilibrium. So it's separating conditioned on the player's bidding. But in some cases, when the valuation is small, then there is no bidding, which means only the latency competition survives. And that threshold is square root of delta over g minus delta. So it's like sort of a simple graph. We have 2 bidders here in red and blue, and the red has made a latency investment. That's why its transaction timestamp is lower. And you can see up to a specific valuation point, there's no bidding, after which both players bid, and they're roughly similar to a standard all-pay auction. In the second model that we chose, this is the ex-post latency investment and bidding. So basically here, players can invest both in latency and bidding at the same time, and essentially choose whatever is cheaper. So for any additional delta T time they want to buy, they can choose to invest either in the latency infrastructure or bidding, whichever is cheaper. And this sort of depends upon what our parameter G is and what our constant C is. Intuitively, if you have a larger G window, you incentivize more bidding than latency investment. So there's some tension there between the parameters. As one sort of final point, to compare time boost against something like a pure bidding policy, where you can take all the transactions in some G length interval and sort by descending bids. So intuitively, this can also be modeled as a discrete version of our time boost policy, where you round the timestamp before applying this priority function. And I'll say that both of these policies can satisfy these independent of irrelevant transactions property. So just to offer one comparison point between these two transactions, you can say that continuous time boost is better for external market signals, especially when G is small. So when you have market updates that happen external to the system, you can have the continuous version of time boost fare better. But in some cases, when you have internal state updates, pure bidding policy completely gets rid of any latency advantage, whereas time boost still has some latency advantage to it. I'll briefly talk about decentralized implementation as well. There's sort of two ways that you can do this. One is the decentralized nodes can first agree on the timestamp and then apply sort of a time boost policy. So for example, you can use median timestamp or other first come, first serve policies and then apply this bidding function to get the final result. Or you can use time boost locally first and then use sort of an aggregation protocol to combine the local orderings. But the decentralized implementation is left to future work and sort of like an implementation as well. Just concluding thoughts. We want an ordering policy that minimizes latency racing by moving the spending to bids while still keeping some nice properties both for users and arbitrageurs. And time boost is one such policy that we investigated, but there's a whole open area of research for understanding this design space better. And we sort of need more experiments before practical deployment, especially with regards to the parameter choices and whether discrete versus continuous time boost fares in different settings. Thank you.
Questions?
So I have a question. Why do you think that we haven't seen this kind of mechanism of bribing a centralized sequencer to essentially give you like negative latency in the traditional financial settings? Like, why does NASDAQ not take a bribe where they buffer all of their transactions by 100 milliseconds and they say, if you pay me money, you can, execute faster? And there's coloing and things like that, which are sort of these side games that people play. But why haven't they taken the initiative to create like an overt sort of bribing system?
I think you should ask the SEC. No. I think so I'm not an expert on traditional finance, but at least the way I realize it is it's actually not legal for the exchange to have these sort of bids. But what it can do is it can sell sort of the same thing to everyone. It can't give preferential treatment based on preferential ordering treatment based on bids. So what it can do is sell co-location. So for example, NYSE and NASDAQ, they sell co-location racks next to their servers for a specific amount that anyone can sort of buy.
Yeah, I think my question is like maybe one thing that isn't so great about this, I guess people can go back in time if some change happens and kind of subvert what happened previously. Like if, say you have 50 milliseconds available to buy in time boost and everybody's like co-located on the same cage in AWS East 1 or something, like you can go back in time. And one of the things we know about at least the L1 arbitrage market is that there's a bunch of adverse selection that comes in with latency advantages. So I wonder if you guys have thought about kind of extending the arbitrage opportunity to continuous time. And then we see, okay, here's the arbitrage opportunity. It's now I take the trade and the price has some more movement after that. If the price moves even more, now a second arbitrager comes in and kind of goes back in time and takes an even better trade. So now if the price kind of moves in the direction that's favorable to the first arbitrager, he's losing, getting adverse selected. And if it goes against him, he's still winning. Do you guys worry about that at all?
So I'll say we consider the centralized setting, where it's very different than the decentralized setting in the case that so in our model at least, the centralized sequencer is trusted to hold the transactions before the state update is done at the end of the block. And this is kind of equivalent to having, let's say, an encrypted mempool in a decentralized setting. So you won't get that problem of now some more information is really revealed and you can go more back in time to take advantage of it, because that block will sort of be published by the time that you can take advantage of it again. So you can only buy up to G time, and it's sort of exponentially worse the further down you go, and you can only buy up to G time. So if G time has passed since the transaction arrived, then you can publish it without being able to sort of go back in time and front run it, if that makes sense.
Anyone else?
Have you considered what's like the optimal policy for, I don't know, what's the reasonable metric here?
Optimal policy in terms of?
In terms of what metric, I'm not sure myself. And so
yeah, I think
it's a question, really.
I think definitely an open problem there of how best to understand like what is optimal for bidding versus like latency. So for example, we can show that essentially we want to move most of the investment from latency to bidding. So you can say like the best possible outcome is everything moves to bidding rather than latency, or most of it moves to bidding rather than latency.
Well, I think you mentioned a trade-off that the higher the G, you achieve what you're saying. Right?
Yeah, so there's actually this tension there, because the higher the G, the better you have for moving things to bidding. And like the lower the G, the better sort of the user experience, because you also don't want to delay like for 20 seconds a user transaction. So there is this tension there, and I think there's this interesting open design space of where to pick the best possible solution there.
Anyone else? I had one last question, which is, so this is still sort of almost clearly a non-truthful auction, because it's just first price with the entry fee effectively. So how do you think about the design? You had very weak constraints first, right? Like gradient goes up, concave, but then you had a very sort of like sharp function.
Yeah.
But as you change that function, you'll change how close you are to truthful for like the average bidder. So do you have any indication of like, hey, if I have like a sort of faster gradient but lower, some properties of the Hessian, like do I get more truthfulness or less truthfulness?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we didn't consider sort of different cost functions, which is an open problem. So a lot of this analysis might be intractable, of finding like the best sort of parameterization. And so we kind of chose one reasonable function and did some of the analysis with it. But yeah, finding more generalized solutions for this is definitely an interesting problem.
Cool. And with that, I guess we end the session.